Hello, how are you? It's me, your narrator for Sleepless Nights, ready to dive into another monotonous story in the series, Boring Bedtime Stories, what sex was like in medieval times and much more. Before you start, turn off the light, snuggle up on your soft pillow and let the modern world outside. If you like what you hear, give it a like and subscribe, but only if you want to. No pressure. In the comments, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. Now take a deep breath, relax, and let's travel. The Middle Ages. A period often romanticized in movies and books, where gallant knights courted ladies in imposing castles, and life seemed to have a bucolic simplicity. But, my dear sleepy listener, allow me to demystify this image with a dose of reality that, I guarantee, will make you thank for every drop of running water and soap in your life. Let's start with the basics, the fundamentals, the smell. Yes, the smell. Because to understand medieval intimacy, you must first understand the environment in which it flourished, or more accurately, molded. Imagine yourself transported to a medieval village. Not a picturesque postcard village, but a real one. The air is a symphony of odors that would make your modern nose recoil in horror. There's the pungent stench of animal manure, mixed with the acrid smell of peat smoke and burning wood. Add to this the rancid aroma of decaying organic waste, which was often simply dumped on the streets or in open pits. And, of course, the human smell. The human smell. No daily showers, no deodorants, no fluoride toothpaste. People wore the same clothes for weeks, sometimes months without washing them. Water was a precious resource. Its use was prioritized for cooking and drinking, not for personal hygiene. Baths were rare, often limited to once or twice a year, and even then, the water was shared by the whole family, starting with the head of the household and ending with the children and servants, in a sequence that would make any of us question the very definition of cleanliness. Think about the houses. Small, dark, poorly ventilated. Often domestic animals such as pigs and chickens shared the same space with humans, adding their own olfactory and sanitary contributions to the environment. Latrines, when they existed, were holes in the ground or rudimentary structures that dumped their contents directly into nearby ditches or rivers, which in turn were the same sources of water for drinking and cooking. It is an image that, for our modern sensibilities, is almost unbearable. Now try to imagine intimacy in this scenario. That moment of closeness, of touch, of shared breathing. There was no expectation of fresh breath or softly scented skin. The kiss, if it happened, would come with the aftertaste of the last meal. Perhaps a stew of rancid vegetables or crusty bread. The touch would be on a skin that carried the accumulated sweat of days of hard work in the fields, or the smell of smoke and soot from a poorly ventilated fireplace. The texture of the skin would be rough, perhaps with scabs of dirt or untreated wounds. The lack of hygiene was not just a matter of odor, it was a matter of health. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions. Skin diseases were common. Infections were a daily threat. And all this was reflected in intimacy. There was not the delicacy or sensuality that we associate with sex today. It was something more raw, more visceral, more necessary. Procreation was the primary goal, and pleasure, if it existed, was a secondary bonus, often overshadowed by the practical and uncomfortable realities of medieval life. The romanticization of the Middle Ages makes us forget that for most people, life was a constant struggle against dirt, disease, and hunger. Intimacy in this context was not a romantic interlude, but a part of the harsh reality of existence. It was an act that took place in the midst of unpleasant odors, in cramped spaces without privacy, with bodies that did not know the luxury of daily cleaning. And if you're starting to feel a slight nausea, congratulations. You're starting to understand the true boring history of medieval hygiene and how it shaped every aspect of life, including the most intimate. Sleep well with this image. Now that your imaginary nose has become accustomed to medieval effluvia, let's move on to another luxury that you, my dear listener, probably don't even realize you have. Privacy. The sweet and glorious privacy. The ability to close a door, to have a space of your own, where your thoughts and, more importantly, your actions can remain hidden from the prying eyes of the world. In the Middle Ages, this was a fantasy as distant as an espresso machine. Imagine your home. Now imagine that your house is a single room. A room where you eat, sleep, work, and yes, reproduce. And not just you, but your whole family. Your parents, your siblings, maybe your children, and even some pets such as chickens or a pig, who offered extra warmth on cold nights and, of course, a peculiar aroma. Peasant houses were mostly small one-room huts, with dirt floors and a hole in the ceiling for fireplace smoke to escape. Or not. There were no interior walls, no doors to close except for the one at the entrance, which was more to keep the cold and the wolves out than to ensure any kind of seclusion. Even in the homes of the wealthiest, such as feudal lords or gentry, privacy was an alien concept. The castles and large houses were full of people, servants, guards, guests, distant relatives, all roamed freely. Rooms, when they existed, were often passageways to other rooms, and beds were often shared not only by couples, but by several people to save heat. Think of a camping dorm room, but without the benefit of thin walls or curtains. So, how did intimacy take place in this scenario? The answer is, with a lot of people around. There was no concept of a moment alone. The sexual act for most people took place with the family sleeping a few feet away, perhaps even in the same bed. There were no romantic whispers or elaborate foreplay. It was a quick, functional act, done under the cover of darkness and, it was hoped, the deep sleep of the other occupants of the room. Discretion was the key, not out of shame, but out of practicality. No one wanted to wake up their grandmother or younger brother with inopportune moans. The lack of privacy profoundly shaped the conception of intimacy. Sex was not a private, romantic act between two individuals, but a function of family and social life. It was something that happened because it needed to happen, for procreation, for the continuity of the lineage, for the survival of the community. Individual pleasure, if it existed, was secondary to biological and social necessity. There was no room for the idealized romance we see in movies. There was no luxury of lingering, of exploring, of giving himself completely without the awareness that, at any moment, a neighbor or a relative could cough, turn over in bed, or, worse, wake up and observe. The conception of intimacy in the Middle Ages was therefore radically different from ours. It wasn't about shared secrets or moments together. It was about constant physical proximity, uninterrupted coexistence with other human beings, and the acceptance that almost nothing in his life was truly his own, much less his body and his most intimate actions. The idea of a double bedroom with a locked door would be as incomprehensible to a medieval peasant as the idea of a smartphone. And if you're starting to get a chill down your spine at the thought of such a lack of personal space, maybe it's a good time to thank you again for your lockable door. Have you ever wondered, my dear listener, how the Catholic Church, that ancient and omnipresent institution in the Middle Ages, saw sex? If you imagine a scenario of debauchery or celebration of carnal pleasure, get ready for a dose of reality that will make your body relax even more in bed, thanking you for living in less times. Restrictive. For the medieval church, sex was not an act of romantic love, nor an expression of mutual desire. It was, above all, a tool for procreation. And that's it. The doctrine of the church was clear and implacable. Sex was intrinsically linked to original sin. The fall of Adam and Eve in Eden, according to medieval theology, was directly associated with lust and carnal desire. Therefore, any sexual act that did not have as its explicit objective the generation of offspring was considered a sin, and not just any sin, but one that could lead to eternal damnation. Think about it. Every passionate kiss, every touch that was not aimed at conception, every moment of pleasure unrelated to procreation was a step towards the fires of hell. Medieval theologians, with their brilliant and sometimes frighteningly logical minds, debated incessantly about the minutiae of the sexual act. St. Augustine, for example, argued that sexual pleasure itself was evidence of the corruption of human nature after the fall. He saw uncontrollable desire as a divine punishment. St. Thomas Aquinas, a little more liberal, if we can use that word in this context, admitted that pleasure was a natural byproduct of the act, but that it should not be the main goal. It was like the sugar in your coffee, acceptable, but not the reason you drink it. This meant that certain sexual positions were considered sinful. Anything other than the position of the missionary, man above, woman below, was viewed with suspicion, as it could indicate a deviation from the procreative purpose. The Church believed that this was the only natural position, and that it allowed for the most efficient conception. Other positions, which might be considered more pleasurable or which were not clearly oriented towards procreation, were seen as acts of lust, and therefore sinful. Imagine the monotony, my dear. There was no room for experimentation, for the search for new sensations. It was a mechanical act, almost a duty. And what about sex outside marriage? That was an abyss of perdition. Fornication, adultery, sodomy, all were mortal sins, punishable not only by excommunication but in some cases by severe penalties imposed by secular laws, which often echoed ecclesiastical morality. The idea of romantic love, of overwhelming passion that justified the union of two bodies, was heresy for the Church. Marriage was a sacrament, yes, but its primary purpose was procreation and the formation of a Christian family, not the satisfaction of individual desire. The Church also imposed periods of sexual abstinence. During Lent, Advent, Sundays and holy days, and even during a woman's menstruation or pregnancy, sex was forbidden. This meant that for a devout medieval couple, there were more days in the year when sex was forbidden than allowed. Sexual life was a series of interruptions, prohibitions, guilt. There was no room for spontaneity, for the desire that comes out of nowhere. Everything was regulated, controlled, watched. Think of the psychological pressure this generated. Each sexual act was a balance between the duty to procreate and the fear of sin. The pleasure, if felt, was accompanied by guilt. Intimacy, which for us is a space of freedom and connection, was for them a minefield of divine rules and prohibitions. There was not the lightness, the joy, the celebration of the body that, in more recent times, we have begun to rediscover. It was a burden, an obligation, a narrow path between salvation and condemnation. And if you're feeling a weight in your chest just imagining so much restriction, maybe it's a good sign that you're ready to fall asleep, free from the shackles of medieval morality. If you, my dear listener, dream of a fairy tale wedding with vows of eternal love and soulmates meeting under the moonlight, get ready for a dose of medieval reality that will make your romantic heart wither like a flower without water. In the Middle Ages, marriage was not a matter of love, passion, or compatibility of temperaments. It was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, a business, a transaction, a contract, and for most people a contract without happily ever after clauses. Think of the nobles. For them, marriage was a first-rate political and economic tool. It was the way to consolidate lands, forge alliances, seal peace treaties, and guarantee succession. A daughter was a valuable bargaining chip, a son, an heir to perpetuate the family name and its possessions. It didn't matter if the bride was 12 and the groom 40, or if they had never seen each other before their wedding day. What mattered was the dowry she brought, the land he owned, and the power that the union of their families could generate. Love? Love was a luxury, a rare and unexpected byproduct, which perhaps, with a lot of luck, could flourish after years of forced coexistence. But it was not a prerequisite. And for the peasants, life was even more pragmatic. Marriage was a necessity for the survival and continuity of the family unit. Hands were needed to work the land, mouths to feed, and heirs to ensure that the property, no matter how small, remained in the family. A peasant couple did not marry out of love, but out of mutual necessity. Women brought domestic skills and the ability to bear children, man the strength to plow and protect. It was a working partnership, a miniature agricultural enterprise. Emotions were secondary to the ability to produce food and offspring. The choice of spouse was rarely an individual decision. For the nobles, the parents or guardians made all the negotiations, often from the childhood of those involved. For the peasants, the community and the extended family had an enormous weight. Marrying someone from outside the village was unusual and often frowned upon. The reputation of the family, the work capacity of the future spouse, and economic compatibility were the decisive factors. The idea of choosing your partner based on personal feelings was almost unthinkable. Marriage was a rite of passage, yes, but with a much more earthly than heavenly focus. The ceremony, though blessed by the Church, was more of a public acknowledgement of a social and economic contract. There wasn't the pomp and glamour that we associate with modern weddings. It was a simple event, often held at the door of the church with witnesses to ensure that the agreement was legally binding. The party, if there was one, was a celebration of the new union of resources and manpower, not of a romantic love. And what happened if the business didn't work out? Divorce, as we know it today, was virtually non-existent. The church did not allow it. In extreme cases of nullity, such as forced marriage or consanguinity, the union could be annulled, but it was a long, expensive, and rare process. For most, it was a matter of enduring. Infidelities, though sinful, were often tolerated, especially if they did not threaten the family structure or inheritance. Marital happiness was a bonus, not an expectation. Think of the coldness of this reality. His whole life planned, not by his own desires, but by the needs of his family, his lineage, his property. The partner of his life chosen by others, based on criteria that had little to do with his own happiness. Intimacy, in this context, was a duty, a part of the contract rather than an expression of affection. And if you're feeling a chill at the thought of such a lack of personal agency, maybe it's a good time to be thankful for living in an era where love, as complicated as it is, still has a chance to be the reason for a yes. Now, my dear listener, let us touch on a subject which, to our modern sensibilities, is particularly uncomfortable, but which was an undeniable reality in the Middle Ages, the age of consent, or more precisely, the absence of it as we understand it today. If you think of teenagers discovering love and sexuality at a gradual and protected pace, prepare for a shock. At that time, childhood was a much shorter concept, and adult life with all its responsibilities came very, very early. For the church, the minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Yes, you heard it right, 12 and 14. And while these were the legal ages, in practice, arranged marriages could be promised and even consummated before that, especially among the nobility, where succession and alliances were urgent. A 12-year-old girl was considered a woman ready for marriage and, consequently, for procreation. There was no room for adolescence as a period of transition, of personal discoveries, of identity formation. The transition from childhood to adulthood was abrupt and brutally practical. Imagine yourself being 12 years old. You were probably worried about homework, playing with friends, maybe your first platonic crush. Now imagine being given in marriage to a man, perhaps twice or triple his age, with the immediate expectation of consummating the union and soon generating heirs. There was no idea of informed consent or emotional maturity. The ability to procreate was what defined marriage readiness, not the ability to understand the complexities of a relationship or to make autonomous decisions about one's own body. For girls, this reality was particularly harsh. Their sexuality was seen almost exclusively in terms of their reproductive capacity. They were trained from an early age to be wives and mothers, and their virginity was a precious asset to be protected until marriage, as it guaranteed the legitimacy of the heirs. Once married, the pressure to get pregnant was immense. Fertility was a sign of divine blessing and social value. Infertility, on the other hand, was a curse often attributed to the woman, and could lead to rejection, repudiation, or, in extreme cases, annulment of marriage. For boys, although reproductive pressure was equally present, the experience was somewhat different. They had more freedom to explore their sexuality before marriage, even though the church condemned fornication. However, the expectation of providing for the family and perpetuating the line was a heavy burden. Masculinity was defined by the ability to work, to fight, and to bear children. Male sexuality was seen as a powerful force, which needed to be channeled into marriage and procreation, but which was also inherently dangerous and tempting. The lack of a meaningful age of consent, coupled with the utilitarian view of marriage, meant that sexuality in the Middle Ages was devoid of much of the individual agency we associate with it today. It wasn't about choice. It wasn't about mutual desire. It wasn't about building a partnership based on affection. It was about duty, about reproduction, about the perpetuation of the family and society. Children were transformed into adults before they even had the chance to be children, and their sexuality was immediately put at the service of purposes greater than pleasure or personal connection. Think of the naivety, the lack of knowledge, the vulnerability of these young brides and young husbands. There was no sex education. There were no open conversations about the body or desire. What they learned was through observation, experience, and often trauma. Intimacy was a rite of passage, yes, but one that was imposed, not chosen. And if you're feeling a lump in your throat at the thought of so much lost innocence, maybe it's a good time to snuggle up even more in your pillow and be thankful for living in a time where childhood is a right and consent is a requirement. If you, my dear listener, have ever found yourself flipping through a modern Kama Sutra manual, or exploring the infinite possibilities of intimacy, prepare for a reality check that will have your imagination retreating into a corner and covering itself with a sheet of boredom. In the Middle Ages, creativity in the bedroom was not only discouraged, but actively condemned. For the church, which dictated the rules of morality and, by extension, sexuality, there was a right position for sex, and only one: the position of the missionary. Yes, that one. Man on top, woman on bottom. Why? Because according to medieval theology, this was the only position that allowed conception in a natural and dignified way. It was the position that mimicked the divine order of creation, with man dominating and woman receptive. Any deviation from this norm was seen as a perversion, an act of unbridled lust, an attempt to seek pleasure rather than procreation. And as we have already discussed, pleasure was an acceptable byproduct but never the main goal. Think about monotony. There was no room for experimentation, for the search for new sensations, for the mutual exploration of bodies. Intimacy was a functional, almost mechanical act, repeated ad nauseum in the same position, with the same objective. The idea that sex could be a source of joy, of deep connection, of sensory exploration, was alien. It was a conjugal duty, a means to an end. And the end was to have children. Many children, if possible, to guarantee the labor on the farm and the salvation of the soul. The consequences of deviating from this norm were severe. There were no how-to manuals for pleasure, but there were many sermons and penitentials, books that listed sins and their respective penances, that detailed the punishments for deviant practices. Anal sex, oral sex, and any other position other than that of the missionary were considered serious sins, often equated with sodomy, which was one of the worst sins imaginable, punishable by excommunication, and in some cases, even death. The church saw these practices as against nature, as they could not lead to procreation. Imagine the pressure. Not just the pressure of having to conform to a single position, but the psychological pressure of knowing that every wrong move could be a step toward hell. Guilt was a constant companion. Desire, which is such a natural and powerful force, was seen as an evil temptation that needed to be controlled and directed toward the only purpose approved by God. There was no room for spontaneity, for the passion that leads to exploring the limits of body and mind. Everything was regulated, watched, judged. Even the frequency of sex was regulated. As mentioned, there were long periods of abstinence imposed by the church: Lent, Advent, Sundays, holy days, periods of menstruation and pregnancy. This meant that even within the only position allowed, opportunities were limited. The sex life of a devout medieval couple was a series of interruptions, prohibitions, guilt. There was not the lightness, the joy, the celebration of the body that, in more recent times, we have begun to rediscover. Sexuality in this context was devoid of much of the individual agency we associate with it today. It wasn't about choice, it wasn't about mutual desire. It wasn't about building a partnership based on affection. It was about duty, about reproduction, about the perpetuation of the family and society. And most of all, it was about compliance, conformity to the rules of the church, to social expectations, to the worldview that saw the body as a vessel of sin and pleasure as a snare of the devil. So the next time you feel bored with the routine, or your partner suggests something a little out of the ordinary, remember medieval couples. Remember the monotony imposed, the fear of sin, the absence of choice. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the freedom we have today to explore, to experiment, to find pleasure in all its forms, without the shadow of eternal damnation hanging over the bed. Sleep well, and dream of a world of possibilities. You, my dear listener, who live in an era where contraception is a matter of choice, of colored pills, of discrete devices, and of access to reliable information, prepare for a trip to the past where birth control was a mixture of despair, superstition, and, frankly, a risk to one's life. In the Middle Ages, the idea of planning a family was as exotic as a flight to the moon. Life was a Russian roulette of pregnancies, and the only certainty was that if you were fertile, nature would do its job, whether you wanted it to or not. The church, as we have seen, was vehemently opposed to any form of birth control. Sex was for procreation, and interfering with that process was a grave sin. This meant that there was no incentive for research or the development of effective methods. What remained were popular traditions, folklore, and the desperate attempts of women who, exhausted from successive pregnancies and dangerous births, sought any relief. Imagine the scene. A woman, perhaps already with several children, living in unsanitary conditions, with little food and hard work. Each new pregnancy was a threat to her life and that of her existing children. What would she do? She had no access to doctors with modern knowledge, nor to pharmacies with safe options. She turned to what was available, the knowledge passed down by word of mouth, the herbs of the village healer, the superstitions that promised hope. And what were these methods? Prepare for the bizarre and the dangerous. There was a belief that drinking molten lead, yes, lead, could cause infertility, or perhaps a potion made from weasel testicles or animal feces. Some women attempted abortions using abortifacient herbs, such as rue or pennyroyal, which were extremely toxic and often caused severe bleeding, infections, and often the death of the woman herself. There was no precise dosage. There was no knowledge about the side effects. It was a blind bet against life itself. Other methods were more symbolic than effective. It was believed that tying a weasel testicle or a piece of owl bone to the thigh could prevent pregnancy, or that jumping back 7 times after intercourse would make the sperm fall out. There was also the practice of coitus interruptus, which, although rudimentary, was perhaps the most scientific method available, but which required a control and discipline that was not always possible, and which was nevertheless condemned by the church. Prolonged breastfeeding was, for many women, the only natural way to space pregnancies, although it was not an infallible method. Women breastfed their children for years, sometimes until they were 3 or 4 years old, hoping to delay the return of fertility. But even that was not a guarantee, and many women found themselves pregnant again while still breastfeeding a baby. The life of a medieval woman was largely defined by her reproductive capacity. She was a baby-making machine, and every pregnancy was a risk. The lack of safe and effective contraception meant that the only way to avoid pregnancy was abstinence, which, in a marriage arranged for the purpose of procreation, was often unfeasible. The hopelessness of not having control over one's own body, over one's own future, was a grim reality for millions of women. So the next time you're bothered by the complexity of choosing a contraceptive method, or the need for a doctor's appointment to get one, remember medieval women. Remember the molten lead, the toxic herbs, the bizarre superstitions. Remember the lack of choice, the lack of knowledge, the constant threat of an unwanted pregnancy and a dangerous birth. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the freedom and security that modern science and medicine have afforded us. Sleep well, and dream of a world where control over one's body is a right, not a miracle. You, my dear listener, who live in an era where a simple blood test can reveal the presence of a multitude of diseases, and where one pill can cure most sexually transmitted infections, prepare to plunge into an abyss of ignorance, stigma, and suffering. In the Middle Ages, venereal diseases were a hidden scourge, a divine punishment, a terrible mystery that spread silently, leaving a trail of pain, deformity, and death. Imagine a world without microscopes, without antibiotics, without the slightest knowledge about bacteria or viruses. People didn't understand how diseases spread, let alone how sexual diseases. They attributed them to miasmas, to imbalances of moods, to witchcraft, or more often to the wrath of God. If you contracted a disease that caused open wounds, rashes, or excruciating pain, the most common explanation was that you had sinned. And if the sin were sexual, the shame and ostracism were as devastating as the disease itself. Syphilis, for example, although its exact origin in Europe is debated, some historians believe that it arrived with Columbus's sailors, others that it already existed before, became a devastating epidemic from the end of the 15th century, already on the threshold of the Middle Ages. But even before it, other infections such as gonorrhea and chlamydia, though not identified as such, certainly existed, causing infertility, blindness, and chronic pain. The lack of treatment meant that these diseases progressed unchecked, leading to horrific complications. Think of the open wounds that didn't heal, the rashes that covered the body, the joint pains that turned every movement into torture. Imagine gradual blindness, paralysis, dementia, and all this happening in public, without the slightest understanding of what was happening and with the certainty that you were a sinner deserving of such suffering. There were no specialized hospitals, only shelters for the poor and sick where hygiene was non-existent and contamination was inevitable. The stigma was immense. If you showed the visible symptoms of a venereal disease, you were immediately marked as someone who had given into lust. This meant social exclusion, loss of reputation, and, for women, complete ruin. There was no compassion, only judgment. People avoided contact, fearing contamination and association with sin. The treatments were as ineffective as they were dangerous. Mercury, for example, was a popular remedy for syphilis, applied to the skin or ingested. Patients suffered from mercury poisoning, with symptoms such as tooth loss, tremors, neurological problems, and eventually death. It was a choice between a terrible disease and a treatment that was just as terrible. There was no cure, only palliatives that often made the situation worse. The lack of sex education meant that people had no idea how to protect themselves. There were no condoms, there were no awareness campaigns. Sex was an act of faith, a leap in the dark with the hope that luck was on his side. And for many, luck was not there. Diseases spread silently and relentlessly, from one partner to another, from one family to another, from one village to another. Sexual life in the Middle Ages was therefore a minefield. Each intimate encounter carried the risk not only of an unwanted pregnancy, but of an incurable and stigmatizing disease. There was no security of modern medicine, the privacy of diagnosis, no hope of a cure. There was only fear, ignorance, and the inevitability of suffering. And if you're feeling a shiver down your spine at the thought of so much vulnerability, maybe it's a good time to snuggle up even more on your pillow and be thankful for living in an era where science has given us the power to understand, treat, and in many cases, prevent these scourges. Sleep well, and dream of a world of health and knowledge. You, my dear listener, who perhaps associate prostitution with dark alleys and marginality, prepare yourself for a revelation that will make you reconsider the complexity of medieval morality. In the Middle Ages, prostitution, although condemned by the Church as a sin, was often tolerated and even regulated by secular authorities. It was seen as a necessary evil, an outlet for male desires that might otherwise threaten the social order and purity of married and unmarried women. Imagine a medieval city. There was no Tinder, no bars with loud music, no freedom of casual encounters. Marriage was arranged, sex was for procreation, and the Church preached abstinence and chastity. But men, as always, had their instincts. And these instincts, if not channeled, could lead to rape, adultery, and other transgressions that would destabilize society. The solution? A place where these instincts could be discharged in a controlled way. Thus, brothels, often known as stews or bathhouses, emerged, which were establishments licensed and supervised by the municipal authorities. In some cities, such as London, Paris, and Avignon, brothels were even owned by the city or religious institutions, which profited from them. Yes, you heard it right. The Church condemned sin, but did not care to collect taxes on it. It was a convenient hypocrisy, a dark pragmatism that recognized the inevitability of human desire. Prostitutes, often called women of life or public women, lived in a paradoxical existence. They were marginalized, stigmatized, and often subjected to violence and exploitation. But at the same time, they were a recognized part of the urban landscape, with their own rules, their own neighborhoods, and in some cases even their own distinctive garments so that they could be easily identified. In some cities, they were required to wear a specific hat or a colorful cape so that everyone would know who they were. There was no discretion, only the public exposure of his profession. The life of a medieval prostitute was brutal. They were often recruited from among the poorest women, orphans, widows without resources, or those who had been dishonored and had no other form of support. Life expectancy was low, marked by disease, violence, and the constant threat of pregnancy. There was no retirement, no health insurance, no dignity. Beauty, which was its chief capital, faded rapidly under the weight of hard life and lack of hygiene. And what about customers? Men from all walks of life frequented the brothels. Merchants, artisans, students, soldiers, and even clergy. The Church, while condemning fornication, often turned a blind eye to the presence of its own members in these establishments, provided it was done with discretion and without public scandal. It was an open secret, a part of life that everyone knew, but about which few spoke openly. The existence of regulated prostitution reveals a lot about the medieval mentality regarding sex. Male desire was seen as an uncontrollable, almost animal force that needed to be contained, but could not be eliminated. The woman, on the other hand, was divided into two categories: the virgin and the wife, who were pure and for procreation, and the prostitute, who was unclean and for pleasure. It was a cruel dichotomy that dehumanized women and reinforced the idea that sex, outside of marriage and procreation, was dirty and sinful. There was not the slightest concern for the well-being of the women involved. They were seen as a means to an end, a necessary sacrifice for the maintenance of social order. And if you're feeling a chill at the thought of so much dehumanization and hypocrisy, perhaps it's a good time to snuggle up even more in your pillow and be thankful for living in an era where, while prostitution is still a complex issue, there is at least a growing recognition of human dignity and the rights of all individuals. Sleep well and dream of a fairer world. You, my dear listener, who perhaps live in a world where sexual diversity is increasingly recognized and, in many places, legally protected, prepare yourself for a plunge into a past where homosexuality was not only a taboo, but a heinous crime, a sin against nature, and an abomination worthy of the cruelest punishments. In the Middle Ages, the idea of same-sex love or desire was as incomprehensible and terrifying to the mainstream mentality as heresy itself. The Catholic Church, with its ubiquity and overwhelming power, was the main architect of this condemnation. For medieval theologians, sex had a divine and exclusive purpose: procreation. Any sexual act that could not result in children was, by definition, against nature, and therefore sinful. Homosexuality in this context was seen as the quintessence of this sin, a perversion of the natural order established by God. There was no room for understanding that same-sex attraction could be an innate orientation. It was seen purely as a depraved choice, an uncontrolled lust that defied the divine will. Imagine the life of someone who was attracted to people of the same sex at that time. It was an existence of secrecy, of constant fear, of denial of its own nature. There were no supportive communities. There were no terms to describe their identity that were not pejorative. The word sodomy, derived from the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, was the umbrella term for any unnatural sexual act, and homosexuality was at the top of that list. The punishment for sodomy was often death, often by burning at the stake, a form of purification by fire for such a grave sin. Secular laws, influenced by church doctrine, were equally brutal. In many kingdoms and city-states, sodomy was a capital crime. Historical records, though scarce and often distorted by the perspective of the accusers, reveal instances of men and women being tried, tortured, and executed for homosexual acts. The persecution was not only legal, it was social. Those who were discovered were ostracized, their reputations destroyed, their lives ruined. Even in monastic settings where abstinence was the rule, homosexuality was a constant concern for ecclesiastical authorities. Letters and documents from the time reveal the anxiety of bishops and abbots regarding special friendships or disordered affections between monks and nuns. Vigilance was constant, and the punishments for such transgressions, though perhaps not as severe as death, included expulsion from order, imprisonment, and public penance. The dark irony is that despite all the condemnation and persecution, homosexuality existed. Like any natural force, human desire cannot be completely eradicated by decrees or threats. There were no doubt secret lives, hidden codes, and perhaps even small networks of individuals who found solace and affection in one another, away from the watchful eyes of church and state. But these lives were lived in the shadows, under the crushing weight of fear and guilt. There was no room for love, for emotional connection, for the joy of sharing life with someone of the same sex. There was only sin, shame, and the constant threat of terrible punishment. The Middle Ages, in this respect, was a period of darkness and intolerance, where human diversity was seen as an aberration to be eradicated, not celebrated. So the next time you're tempted to romanticize the Middle Ages or to yearn for a simpler time, remember the brutality with which society and the church treated those who didn't fit their narrow definitions of natural and acceptable. Remember the fear, the secrecy, the violence. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the freedom, however imperfect, we have today to love whomever we want, without the shadow of the campfire hanging over our heads. Sleep well, and dream of a world of acceptance and peace. You, my dear listener, who live in an era where sexual violence is, at least in theory, a heinous crime, where there are laws, specialized police stations, and a growing awareness movement, prepare yourself for a trip to a past where brutality was a constant and legal protection for victims of sexual violence was, at best, precarious, and at worst, non-existent. In the Middle Ages, sexual violence was not a shocking anomaly, but a dark and omnipresent reality, often veiled by law and culture. Imagine a world where women were largely property, first from her father, then from her husband. Her honor, her reputation, and her social worth were intrinsically linked to her virginity before marriage and her fidelity afterward. A rape was not seen primarily as a violation of the woman's body and autonomy, but as an injury to the property of the father or husband, or a stain on the honor of the family. The victim was often doubly victimized by the aggression and by the social stigma that followed. Medieval rape laws were complex and, to our modern sensibilities, profoundly unjust. In many cases, the woman's word was not enough. She needed witnesses or physical evidence that, in the absence of modern forensics, was almost impossible to obtain. If the victim did not scream during the attack, or if they did not report the crime immediately, this could be interpreted as consent. The idea that trauma could paralyze a person, or that fear of reprisals could silence them, was completely alien to the legal mindset of the time. And even if rape was proven, the punishments varied enormously and were not always proportional to the severity of the crime. In some places, the perpetrator could be fined or forced to marry the victim to restore his honor and the legitimacy of any child that might be born. Yes, you heard it right. The victim could be forced to marry her abuser, turning the trauma into a life sentence. The idea of justice for the victim, of his recovery and well-being, was secondary to the maintenance of social order and property. For women from the lower classes, the situation was even more desperate. Without resources, without influence, they were the most vulnerable. A rape could mean complete ruin, the loss of any chance of marriage, and the condemnation to marginality. Life in the countryside, with its long working hours and the absence of protection, exposed them to constant risks. Life in the cities, with their dark streets and the presence of soldiers and travelers, was also dangerous. Sexual violence was not limited to rape. Coercion, intimidation, and abuse of power were common. Feudal lords had the right of the first night, jus prime noctis, in some regions. Although their practice is debated by historians, the mere existence of the belief already demonstrates the mentality of the time. The idea that a man of power could exert his will over a woman of lower status was a brutal reality. The church, while condemning lust and sin, often failed to protect the victims. The focus was on the morality of the act, not on the violence suffered by the woman. And as we have already seen, the church itself had its own internal problems with the celibacy and sexual conduct of its members, which made its position even more hypocritical. Lack of sex education, ignorance of consent, and viewing women as property contributed to an environment where sexual violence was endemic and rarely fairly punished. There was no voice for the victims. There was no recognition of their suffering. There was no search for justice as we understand it today. There was only silence, shame, and the perpetuation of a cycle of abuse. So the next time you feel frustrated with the imperfections of the modern legal system, or the slowness of justice, remember medieval women. Remember the absence of protection, the lack of voice, the double victimization. Remember that while we still have a long way to go, we have come a long way in understanding and combating sexual violence. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the importance of every step, no matter how small, toward a safer, fairer world for all. Sleep well, and dream of a future where dignity and security are inalienable rights. You, my dear listener, who live in an era where pregnancy is accompanied by ultrasounds, prenatal exams, equipped hospitals, and specialized medical teams, prepare yourself for a trip to a past where pregnancy and childbirth were, for most women, a Russian roulette with frighteningly low odds. In the Middle Ages, bringing new life into the world was often a death sentence for the mother, the baby, or both. Imagine the life of a medieval woman. She probably married young, often in her teens, and the immediate expectation was that she would become pregnant, and get pregnant again and again. Contraception was non-existent or dangerous, as we have seen, and life was short. The only way to ensure the continuity of the family and the lineage was to have many children, in the hope that some would survive infancy. Each pregnancy, however, was a plunge into the unknown, an endurance test for the female body. There was no knowledge about prenatal nutrition. Diets were poor and unbalanced, especially for the peasant classes who lived on the brink of starvation. Anemia was common, and nutritional deficiencies weakened a woman's body, making her more vulnerable to complications. Heavy physical labor continued during her pregnancy, whether in the field, at home, or in the workshop. There was no maternity leave, nor the concept of rest. Life simply went on with the woman's body carrying an ever-increasing burden. And childbirth? Childbirth. It was a domestic event, attended by midwives who, though experienced, based their knowledge on oral traditions and superstitions, not science. There was no hygiene. The midwife's hands, the bedding, the environment, everything was infested with bacteria. Postpartum infections, such as puerperal fever, were a common cause of death. There were no antibiotics, no knowledge about the importance of sterilization. A simple laceration could turn into a generalized and fatal infection. The complications were numerous, and most of the time, unsolvable. A baby in a breech position, a coiled umbilical cord, a retained placenta, a hemorrhage. Any of these scenarios was an emergency that, in the absence of modern medical intervention, resulted in tragedy. There were no safe cesarean sections, no forceps, no blood transfusions. The pain was excruciating and prolonged, and the woman was at the mercy of nature and the skill, or lack thereof, of the midwife. Maternal mortality was alarmingly high. It is estimated that 1 in 5 women died during childbirth or shortly after, due to complications. For each woman who survived, the experience was often traumatic, leaving physical and emotional scars. And even if the mother survived, the baby's life was still hanging by a thread. Infant mortality was equally devastating, with half of the children not reaching adulthood, succumbing to disease, starvation, or accidents. The church, while encouraging procreation, offered little practical consolation. Childbirth was seen as a divine punishment for Eve's original sin, and pain was a burden to be borne with resignation. There were prayers and rituals, but little real medical help. The woman was alone in her struggle, with faith as her only ally. Think of the constant anxiety, the uncertainty that hung over each pregnancy. The joy of expectation was always tempered by the fear of loss. Women lived with the shadow of death hanging over them each time they became pregnant. There was not the security, the comfort, the hope that we associate with birth today. There was only pain, risk, and resignation. So the next time you feel tired of waiting in a doctor's office waiting room or filling out insurance forms, remember medieval women. Remember the darkness, the pain, the uncertainty. Remember that every birth was a miracle, and every survivor a hero. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get to appreciate the wonder of modern medicine and the safety it provides us. Sleep well, and dream of a world where life is celebrated, not just endured. You, my dear listener, who may have been enchanted by the ballads of troubadours, the platonic love poems, and the image of fearless knights fighting for their ladies, prepare yourself for a dose of reality that will make your romantic heart cringe. In the Middle Ages, there was a concept called courtly love, a literary fantasy that promised a high, pure, and often unconsummated passion between a knight and a married lady. But like almost everything else in the Middle Ages, reality was much more prosaic and infinitely less glamorous. Picture the scene. A knight on his knees dedicating his life and his prowess in battle to an unattainable lady, usually his lord's wife. He composed poems, sang songs, performed heroic deeds in his name. The lady in turn was the inspiration, the muse, the embodiment of perfection. This love was idealized, platonic, and often secret. It was a game of intellectual and emotional seduction, where physical consummation was secondary or even forbidden to maintain purity of feeling. It looked beautiful, didn't it? An escape from the brutality of medieval life. But let's get to the facts. Courtly love was largely an invention of the nobility, a pastime for the idle elite who had the time and resources to devote to such frivolities. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, the artisans, the serfs, life was a daily struggle for survival. There was no time for elaborate processions, for love poems, or for platonic passions. Marriage was a practical arrangement, and sex was a necessity for procreation. The idea of an idealized love was as distant as that of a daily hot bath. In addition, courtly love was often a form of entertainment and status display. A knight who managed to attract the attention of a lady of high lineage gained prestige. The lady, in turn, enjoyed the adulation and attention, which were rare in arranged marriages and often without affection. It was a game of power and reputation, where emotions were in many cases secondary to social performance. And what happened when the line between the platonic and the physical was crossed? Then the story changed. Adultery, although romanticized in literature, was a grave sin and a social crime. If discovered, it could lead to misfortune, violence, and in extreme cases, death. The honor of the family was everything, and a stain on it was unacceptable. Courtly love literature often ignored these brutal consequences, focusing only on the beauty of the ideal. Think of the hypocrisy. While the troubadours sang about pure and elevated loves, the reality of arranged marriages and poor hygiene persisted. While knights idealized their ladies, women's lives were one of subordination and the constant risk of pregnancy and childbirth. Courtly love was an escape from reality, a way to make life a little more bearable for those who could afford to dream. And even for those who practiced courtly love, the line between fantasy and reality was thin. Passion, no matter how platonic, could lead to real and dangerous feelings. The temptation was constant and the repression of desire a continual struggle. There was no freedom to express affection openly, to build a relationship based on mutual choice. Everything was veiled, secret, forbidden. The truth is that courtly love was more of a social and literary construct than a generalized practice. It was an ideal, not a reality. And like many medieval ideals, it served to mask an existence that was, for most, brutal, pragmatic, and devoid of romance. There was not the delicacy, the subtlety, the emotional depth that we associate with love today. There was only necessity, duty, and, for a privileged few, fantasy. So the next time you find yourself sighing for a knight in shining armor, remember the dirt, disease, lack of privacy, and brutality of medieval life. Remember that love as we know it today was a rare and dangerous luxury. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the complexity and freedom of your own relationships which, while imperfect, are built on a much more solid foundation than a troubadour's fantasy. Sleep well, and dream of a real love. You, my dear listener, who perhaps spend hours choosing the perfect outfit to express your individuality, or who feel comfortable in outfits that reveal a little more of the skin, get ready for a trip to a past where clothing was not a matter of fashion or comfort but of morality, status, and above all, modesty. In the Middle Ages, the body was seen as a receptacle of sin, and clothing as an armor to hide it, especially the female body. Imagine yourself in a medieval day. There were no light and breathable fabrics like cotton or linen in abundance for everyone. Wool was the queen, heavy, warm, and often rough against the skin. Clothes were made to last, not to be changed daily. There were layers and layers designed to cover, to protect from the cold, and crucially to hide the shapes of the body. The idea of showing off the skin, of highlighting the curves, was unthinkable, an invitation to temptation and sin. For women, modesty was a cardinal virtue. Her hair, considered a temptation, was almost always covered by veils, caps, or scarves. The neckline was non-existent, the sleeves long, and the skirts dragged along the floor, completely hiding the legs. The female body, with its naturally sinuous shapes, was flattened and disguised by corsets and layers of fabric. Pregnancy, which was a constant in the life of the medieval woman, was disguised as much as possible, as the display of a protruding belly was considered indecent. Think of the message it sent. The body, especially the female one, was something to be hidden, to be shamed. Sexuality was a dangerous force that needed to be contained, and clothing was one of the main tools for this containment. There was no room for sensuality, for the celebration of the human form. There was only the repression, the denial, the constant reminder that the body was a portal to sin. And what happened if someone dared to challenge these norms? Social judgment was relentless. A woman who wore clothes considered indecent, perhaps a slightly lower neckline or a slightly tighter fabric, would immediately be branded as a woman of ill repute, a temptress, a sinner. Reputation was everything in the Middle Ages, and a stain on it could ruin a person's life. For men, although the rules were a little less strict, modesty was also expected. The legs were covered by trousers or socks, and the torso by tunics or doublets. The display of muscles or body shapes was rare and in many contexts considered vulgar. Masculinity was expressed through strength, skill in combat, the ability to provide not through physical display. The church, of course, played a key role in enforcing these dress codes. Sermons often condemned vanity, ostentation, and any form of dress that might incite lust. Clothing was seen as a reflection of the soul, and modest clothing was a sign of piety and virtue. The lack of hygiene, which we have already discussed, also influenced clothing. The clothes were heavy and hot, which led to a buildup of sweat and body odors. Washing was rare, and clothes were often infested with parasites. The idea of a fresh and clean outfit which would enhance the natural beauty of the body was an unimaginable luxury. Sexuality in this context was something that existed in spite of clothing, not because of it. It was an act that took place under layers of wool and linen, on bodies that were more often dirty than clean, and in an environment where privacy was a myth. The clothes were not an invitation, but a barrier, a way to hide what was considered shameful. So the next time you're tempted to complain about your wardrobe, or the difficulty of finding the perfect outfit, remember the layers of wool, the lack of hygiene, the constant repression of the body. Remember that clothing was not a form of expression, but a tool of control. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the freedom we have today to wear whatever we want, to express who we are, and to celebrate the beauty of the human body, without the shadow of condemnation hanging over every seam. Sleep well, and dream of a world of lightweight fabrics and freedom. You, my dear listener, who rely on modern science to understand the workings of your body, with its complex systems, hormones, and cells, get ready for a trip to a past where medicine was a fascinating mix of observation, superstition, and a theory that dominated medical thought for more than 1,000 years, the theory of humors. In the Middle Ages, sexuality was not seen as a complex biological function, but as a delicate balance of bodily fluids that, if maladjusted, could lead to illness, madness, and, of course, problems in bed. Imagine a medieval doctor. He had no microscopes, no blood tests, no knowledge of anatomy as we know it. His understanding of the human body was based on the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, who postulated the existence of 4 main humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each mood was associated with an element: air, water, fire, earth; a quality: hot, cold, dry, humid; and a temperament: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic. Health was the result of a perfect balance of these humors. The disease, an imbalance. And sexuality? It was intrinsically linked to this system. Semen, for example, was considered a derivative of blood, a precious substance that, if retained in excess, could cause disease, and if expelled in excess, would lead to weakening. Ejaculation was seen as a way to purge the body of excesses, but also as an act that consumed vital energy. For women, menstruation was the way to purge excess humors, and the absence of it was a sign of imbalance, often associated with hysteria or other afflictions. Think about complexity. If you had an excess of blood, perhaps you felt more passionate, more sanguine. If he had excess yellow bile, he could be more irritable, more angry. And all of this influenced their libido, their ability to procreate, and even their preference for a partner. The idea that sexual desire was purely a matter of brain chemistry or personal attraction was completely alien. It was a question of fluids, of internal temperatures, of a precarious balance that needed to be constantly monitored. Treatments for sexual problems were also based on this theory. If a man suffered from impotence, the doctor could prescribe a diet to balance his moods or bloodletting to remove excess blood. If a woman had difficulty conceiving, she might be advised to consume certain hot or wet foods to stimulate fertility, or to use herbs that were supposed to regulate female moods. There were no blue pills, no hormone treatments, just an attempt to manipulate these invisible fluids. Masturbation, although condemned by the church as a sin, was also seen by medicine as an act that could unbalance the moods, leading to weakness, blindness, or madness. Excessive sexual abstinence, on the other hand, was also considered dangerous as it could lead to the accumulation of moods and melancholy. It was a constant dilemma: how to maintain the perfect balance between purgation and retention, between pleasure and health. The lack of real knowledge about the human body meant that many medical conditions were misinterpreted and treated ineffectively. Infertility, for example, was often attributed to humoral imbalances, when the actual cause could be an infection, an anatomical anomaly, or an underlying health problem. Sexuality was a minefield of mysteries and superstitions, where science was more of a philosophy than an evidence-based practice. Medieval medicine, in this respect, was a reflection of the worldview of the time. Everything was interconnected. Everything was a sign. The body was a microcosm of the universe, and its imbalances were a reflection of larger imbalances. Sexuality was not just a physical act, but an act that had cosmic implications which affected the balance of the whole being. So the next time you're tempted to complain about a lengthy doctor's appointment, or the complexity of a diagnosis, remember the humors, the bloodletting, the herbal potions, and the ignorance that surrounded understanding the human body. Remember that sexuality was a battleground for internal fluids, and that pleasure was a byproduct of a precarious balance. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get to appreciate the wonder of modern medicine, which allows us to understand and care for our bodies in a way that medievals could never have dreamed of. Sleep well, and dream of a body in perfect balance. You, my dear listener, who may rely on dating apps, advice from friends, or perhaps a good perfume to attract love, get ready for a trip to a past where passion was a minefield of superstitions, bizarre rituals and spells that promised everything from eternal love to instant fertility. In the Middle Ages, when science was incipient and the church condemned magic, people clung to any thread of hope to control the uncontrollable, the heart and the body. Imagine the life of a young peasant or a maiden who ardently desired a mate. There were no proms, no loud music parties, no freedom to flirt openly. The marriage was arranged, life was hard, and love, if it happened, was a bonus. But desire, human desire, is a powerful force, and it found its own ways, often in the shadows of superstition. There were a plethora of amulets and talismans. It was believed that carrying a piece of mandrake root with its humanoid form could attract a lover, or maybe a wolf tooth or a bone from a specific animal. People used herbs, stones, and even animal parts in complex rituals, hoping to arouse someone's affection. Think of the scene. A young man, perhaps with a piece of dried pigeon heart in his pocket, trying to approach the girl he desired, while the smell of peat smoke and pig sweat hung in the air. Romance, as you can imagine, was quite a different concept. Love potions were particularly popular and often dangerous. Made with a mixture of herbs, bodily fluids, yes, bodily fluids such as menstrual blood or urine for a personal touch, and bizarre ingredients like bat wings or black cat dander. These concoctions were meant to induce love or passion. It was believed that if the loved one drank the potion, he would fall madly in love. The problem is that many of these herbs were toxic, and the potions could cause anything from hallucinations to severe poisoning. Love, in the Middle Ages, could literally kill you. What about fertility? With the constant pressure to have children, women, and sometimes men, resorted to rituals and spells to secure conception. It was believed that sleeping with a chicken egg under your pillow could increase fertility, or that eating certain animal parts, such as a bull's testicles, could guarantee virility. There were fertility rituals that involved dancing in newly planted fields, or bathing in waters considered sacred. The church, of course, condemned these practices as witchcraft, but desperation for an heir often outweighed fear of condemnation. The line between folk medicine, superstition, and witchcraft was thin and dangerous. A healer who prepared teas to relieve labor pains could be the same one who sold love amulets. If her spells worked, she was in demand. If they failed, or if something went wrong, she could be accused of witchcraft and face the stake. Life was a constant balance between hope and fear. Think of the naivety, the lack of scientific knowledge. People didn't understand the biology of reproduction, nor the psychology of attraction. They attributed everything to invisible forces, to spirits, to blessings or curses. Love was not a matter of compatibility or communication, but of magical manipulation, of secret rituals, of bizarre ingredients. Sexuality, in this context, was a minefield of uncertainties. There was no security of science, the clarity of information. There was only blind faith in rituals and the hope that magic, however strange, could bring what the heart desired. And for many, the desire was so strong that it was worth risking one's health, reputation, and even soul. So the next time you're frustrated by the complexity of modern relationships, or the difficulty of finding love, remember lead potions, bone amulets, and fertility rituals using animal feces. Remember that while love is still a mystery, at least we no longer have to resort to witchcraft to try to win it over. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to appreciate the simplicity of a hello on a dating app. Sleep well, and dream of a love without mandrakes. You, my dear listener, who may fight for gender equality, for fair wages, and for autonomy over your own body and your choices, get ready for a trip to a past where women were not seen as individuals with rights and aspirations, but as property. A valuable property, yes, but a property nonetheless whose main function was to procreate and serve. In the Middle Ages, a woman's life was defined by her reproductive capacity and by her subordination to men. Imagine the life of a medieval girl. From birth, his destiny was mapped out. She would be raised to be a wife and a mother. Her education, if there were any, would be focused on domestic skills: spinning, weaving, cooking, childcare. For the nobles, perhaps a little reading and writing, but always with the aim of managing a large house and serving their husbands. The idea of a career, of an independent life, of a voice of your own, was as alien as that of a space rocket. The woman was transferred from the guardianship of the father to that of the husband. She had no right to own land in her own name, except in very specific circumstances, such as widowhood, and even then, her autonomy was limited. Her dowry, which was her contribution to the marriage, was administered by her husband. If she was mistreated, there was nowhere to go. Divorce was practically impossible, and the church, as we have seen, reinforced the idea that the woman should be submissive to her husband. Female sexuality was viewed almost exclusively in terms of her ability to bear children. The woman's body was a vessel, a container for the male seed. His fertility was his greatest virtue, and infertility his greatest flaw. The pressure to get pregnant was immense, and with each pregnancy, the woman faced the real risk of death in childbirth. There was no idea of female pleasure, of self-desire. Sex was a marital duty, an obligation to the husband and to God, who ordained procreation. Think of constant vigilance. The honor of the family depended on the purity of the woman. Her virginity before marriage was a precious commodity, and her fidelity afterwards a non-negotiable requirement. Any deviation was severely punished, with social ostracism, violence, and, in extreme cases, death. Women lived under the weight of unrealistic expectations, with little freedom to be who they really were. Even in religious environments such as convents, women were subject to a male hierarchy. The abbesses, although they had power within their monasteries, still answered to bishops and cardinals. The female voice was silenced, their intellectual and spiritual contributions often ignored or attributed to men. The life of a medieval woman was a series of limitations, limited in their education, limited in their choices, limited in their autonomy. She was defined by her social roles, daughter, wife, mother, and not by her individuality. Their existence was a reflection of the needs of the family, the community, and the church, not their own desires or ambitions. The lack of hygiene, the constant threat of disease, the brutality of daily life, all this was compounded by the lack of power and voice. Medieval women did not have the luxury of complaining, of protesting, of demanding their rights. She simply endured, with a resilience that today seems almost incomprehensible to us. Sexuality, in this context, was a minefield of duties and prohibitions. There was no room for the exploration of one's own body, for the search for pleasure, for the expression of desire. There was only the obligation to procreate, to serve, to be an instrument for the continuity of the lineage. And for many, this was an existence without joy, without choice, without voice, without. So the next time you're tempted to complain about a small injustice or a limitation in your life, remember medieval women. Remember the absence of rights, the constant subordination, the life defined by procreation and service. Remember that the freedom we have today is a hard-won privilege, and maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the importance of every step toward equality, autonomy, and dignity for all women. Sleep well, and dream of a world where every woman's voice is heard and valued. You, my dear listener, who perhaps associate masculinity with fast cars, defined muscles, and a stuffed bank account, Get ready for a trip to a past where being a man meant something much more visceral and, frankly, exhausting. In the Middle Ages, man was not defined by his ability to accumulate goods or to exhibit a sculptural physique, but by his ability to provide, protect, and, crucially, perpetuate the lineage. Imagine the life of a medieval man. From childhood, he was trained for hard work. If he were a peasant, his life would be a constant struggle against the land, the climate, and hunger. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, caring for the animals, all of this required brute strength and resilience. If he were a craftsman, he would spend hours on end in his workshop, producing goods with his own hands. If he were a nobleman, he would be trained in the art of war, horsemanship, and the handling of weapons, as his main function was to protect his lands and his family. Life was physical, dangerous, and required a constant display of virility. Male sexuality was seen as a powerful, almost uncontrollable force that needed to be channeled into marriage and procreation. Virility was synonymous with fertility. A man who could not father children was viewed with suspicion, his masculinity questioned. The pressure to have heirs, especially sons, was immense, as they would ensure the continuity of the family name and the transmission of property. Impotence was a shame, a sign of weakness, and could be grounds for marriage annulment. Think about responsibility. The man was the provider. He was the one who guaranteed the food on the table, the roof over the head, and the safety of the family. This was a heavy burden, especially in a time of uncertain harvests, disease, and constant wars. His family's success depended directly on his strength, his ability, and his ability to work tirelessly. War was an intrinsic part of male life, especially for the nobility. Being a warrior meant being ready to fight, to kill, and to die. Courage, loyalty, and skill in combat were highly valued qualities. Life was brutal, and death a constant companion. Many men did not reach old age, succumbing to battle injuries, illnesses, or accidents. Male sexuality, although freer than female sexuality in terms of exploitation outside of marriage, as we saw in the discussion of prostitution, was still surrounded by rules and expectations. The church condemned lust, fornication, and adultery. However, the reality was that many men sought pleasure outside of marriage, either with prostitutes or with other women. Hypocrisy was a constant, with morality being applied more strictly to women than to men. Poor hygiene, poor diet, and strenuous physical labor took a toll on men's health and longevity. They aged rapidly, their bodies worn out by work and disease. The idea of a midlife crisis or a quest for self-fulfillment was unthinkable. Life was about duty, about survival, about the perpetuation of the lineage. Medieval masculinity was thus a building of strength, resilience, and responsibility. There was no room for vulnerability, for the expression of emotions other than anger or determination. Men were the pillars of the family and society, and their sexuality was a tool to ensure the continuity of this structure. The life of a medieval man was a series of challenges: physical challenges, economic challenges, social challenges. He was defined by his ability to overcome these challenges, to provide for his family, and to perpetuate his name. And for many, this was an existence without rest, without luxury, without the freedom to be who he really was. So the next time you're tempted to complain about a small household chore or a stressful day at work, remember medieval men. Remember the constant struggle for survival, the pressure to provide, the constant threat of war and disease. Remember that masculinity was a heavy burden, and that sexuality was a tool for the perpetuation of the lineage. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the freedom we have today to define masculinity on our own terms, without the shadow of hunger and war hanging over our heads. Sleep well, and dream of a world of peace and prosperity. You, my dear listener, who perhaps believe that sex is a universal experience, equal for everyone, prepare yourself for a dose of reality that will make you reconsider the complexity of human relationships. In the Middle Ages, sexual life was not a monolith. It varied drastically according to social class. What was allowed, expected, or even possible for a nobleman was a universe apart from the reality of a peasant, and both were worlds distant from the life of a cleric. Imagine the sex life of a nobleman. For them, marriage was, as we have seen, a political and economic arrangement. Love was secondary, procreation primordial, marital intimacy, though a duty, was often a formality. However, the nobility had the luxury of privacy, or at least more privacy than the peasants. They had separate rooms, servants who could be dispensed with, and the possibility of retiring to their quarters. But that privacy came with its own pressures. The need to produce legitimate heirs was overwhelming, and infertility was a dynastic catastrophe. Infidelity, though condemned, was a common reality, especially for men who could seek out mistresses and prostitutes without the same level of scrutiny as their wives. Courtly love, with its fantasies of platonic passion, was an escape from the rigidity of arranged marriages, but also a dangerous play of emotions and reputations. Now, turn to the sex life of a peasant. Here, privacy was a myth. Sex took place in one-room huts with the entire family sleeping just a few feet away. There was no room for elaborate foreplay, or for the pursuit of individual pleasure. It was a quick, functional act, done under the cloak of darkness and fatigue. Procreation was an economic necessity. More children meant more hands to work the land. Life was brutal, and sexuality was a part of that brutality. There was no time for romance, for delicacy. Life was about survival, and sex was a tool to ensure the continuity of family and labor. Hygiene was non-existent, bodies were dirty and tired, and intimacy was a crude act, devoid of any glamour. And what about the clergy? The church imposed celibacy, a total renunciation of sexual life. Monks, nuns, priests, everyone should live in chastity. But human nature, my dear listener, is stubborn. The reality was that celibacy was often broken. There were cases of concubinage, of priests with children, of secret homosexual relations. Hypocrisy was widespread. The church preached purity, but its own members, being human, succumbed to the desires of the flesh. The sex life of a clergyman was an existence of denial, of temptation, and often of guilt and secrecy. The punishment for breaking celibacy could range from mild penances to excommunication, but vigilance was constant, and the fear of discovery a permanent shadow. Think about the differences. For the nobleman, sex was a tool of power and procreation, with the possibility of discreet escapes. For the peasant, it was a biological and economic necessity, devoid of privacy or romance. For the clergyman, it was a constant temptation, a sin to be avoided, but often indulged in secret. There was no average sexual experience in the Middle Ages. There was a complex tapestry of realities shaped by wealth, status, religion, and the sheer need to survive. Sexuality in this context was a reflection of social hierarchies. There was no equality, no freedom of choice. There was only duty, necessity, and for some, hypocrisy. And if you're feeling tired just imagining such a disparity, maybe it's a good time to snuggle up even more on your pillow and be thankful that you live in an era where, while inequalities still exist, sex life isn't as rigidly defined by your bank account or your title. Sleep well, and dream of a world where love and desire are more democratic. You, my dear listener, who perhaps believe that sexual morality is an ever-evolving concept, prepare for a trip to a past where the boundaries of what is acceptable were rigidly defined, and the most heinous transgressions were punished with a brutality that would make you thankful for living in less times. Zealous. In the Middle Ages, sexual taboos existed so deep that their mere mention was enough to invoke terror and the harshest condemnation. Imagine a world where the church, with its implacable doctrine, dictated every aspect of life, including the most intimate. Sex, as we have seen, was for procreation and within the confines of marriage. Any deviation from this standard was sin, but some sins were more serious than others, and at the top of the list of the most abominable were incest and bestiality. Incest, sexual intercourse between close relatives, was considered an abomination in all medieval cultures, both by the church and by secular law. The prohibitions were extensive, covering not only blood relatives, consanguinity, but also relatives by marriage, affinity, and even spiritual relatives, godparents and godchildren. Incest was believed to corrupt the lineage, bring divine curses, and produce deformed or diseased offspring. The punishment for incest varied, but could include excommunication, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and in extreme cases, death. Think of the complexity of family relationships in small communities, where everyone was somehow related. Vigilance was constant, and the fear of transgression a shadow hung over every family. Bestiality, sexual intercourse with animals, was perhaps the most absolute and universally condemned taboo. It was seen as the quintessence of perversion, an act that dehumanized the individual and violated the natural order of creation. The punishment for bestiality was almost always death, often by burning at the stake, and in some cases, the animal involved was also executed, as if it were an accomplice to the crime. Such an act was believed to be a direct affront to God, a manifestation of the devil on earth. The mere suspicion of bestiality was enough to ruin a person's life. Think about the mindset behind these bans. It wasn't just a matter of morality. It was a matter of cosmic order. The Middle Ages was a world where the line between the human and the animal, between the sacred and the profane, was rigidly defined. Transgression of these boundaries was seen as a threat to the very structure of society and the divine will. The fear of chaos, disorder, divine punishment was palpable. These taboos were reinforced by stories, legends, and sermons that painted vivid pictures of the dire consequences of such acts. People were taught from an early age to fear these transgressions, to see them as the embodiment of evil. There was no room for understanding, for empathy, for psychological analysis. There was only condemnation, punishment, and ostracism. The existence of these extreme taboos reveals the depth of medieval anxiety about sexuality. Human desire was seen as a dangerous force, which, if not tightly controlled, could lead to degeneration and destruction. Church and state worked together to enforce these norms, using the fear of eternal damnation and earthly punishment as tools of social control. Life in the Middle Ages was a minefield of prohibitions and fears. Sexuality, which for us is such a fundamental aspect of the human experience, was for them a dangerous terrain, full of traps and abysses. And if you're feeling a chill down your spine at the thought of such rigidity and brutality, maybe it's a good time to snuggle up even more on your pillow and be thankful for living in an era where understanding human sexuality is more complex and, hopefully, more compassionate. Sleep well, and dream of a world of freedom and acceptance. You, my dear listener, who perhaps dream of music festivals, of the freedom to dance until dawn and to express yourself without strings attached, prepare yourself for a journey into a past where life was a monotonous routine of work and devotion, punctuated by rare and precious moments of controlled freedom. In the Middle Ages, festivals and carnivals were not just celebrations. They were carefully orchestrated escape valves, where social norms could be temporarily subverted, allowing for a brief and chaotic explosion of joy and, yes, some licentiousness. Imagine the life of a medieval peasant, waking up before the sun, working in the fields until nightfall, eating the same bland porridge, sleeping on a hard floor. The church dictated the rhythm of life, with its fasts, its prohibitions, and its obligatory masses. Sexuality was repressed, pleasure was condemned. But the human being, my dear, is not made to live only on bread and prayer. There was an innate need to vent, to laugh, to sin a little, and that's where festivals came in. Carnival before Lent was the pinnacle of this temporary freedom. It was a period of role reversal, excesses, and revelry. The poor could mock the rich, serfs could imitate their masters, and the rules of decency could be stretched to the limit. People ate and drank to exhaustion, knowing that the period of fasting and penance would soon come. There were wild dances, obscene songs, and yes, an atmosphere of flirtation and encounters that, at other times of the year, would have been unthinkable. Think of the harvest festivals, the celebrations of solstices and equinoxes, the feasts of patron saints. These were moments of respite from the daily toil. People gathered in village squares, in castle courtyards, in fairs. There were jugglers, minstrels, storytellers, and of course a lot of drinking. Mead, beer, and wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and disinhibiting bodies. In these brief moments of freedom, sexuality, which was so rigidly controlled on a daily basis, found small cracks to manifest itself. Eyes crossed, hands touched, bodies brushed against each other in dances. The darkness of the night, the drunkenness, and the atmosphere of permissiveness created an environment where encounters could take place. There was not the privacy of a hotel room, but there were the barns, the woods, the dark corners of taverns. The church, while condemning excesses, often turned a blind eye to these celebrations. It was a lesser evil, a way to release social pressure and avoid greater revolts. It was like a steam that needed to be released so that the pot would not explode. The clergy participated, or at least tolerated it, knowing that after the revelry the people would return to their duties and devotion. However, this freedom was always temporary, and in a way, illusory. Social hierarchies, though reversed for a day, would soon be restored. Sins committed would be confessed and penitentiated. Life would return to its arduous routine and its rigid morality. It was a brief sigh, a blink of disarray before order was restored. Sexuality in these festivals was rawer, more instinctive. There was no delicacy of courtly love, nor the formality of marriage. It was desire in its most basic form, seeking momentary gratification. It was a reminder that behind all the rules and prohibitions, the human body was still driven by primal impulses. So the next time you're tempted to complain about the crowd at a festival, or the mess at a party, remember the medieval peasants. Remember that these were the rare moments when they could breathe, laugh, and perhaps experience a little freedom. Remember that joy was a luxury and disorder was a necessity. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the abundance of opportunities we have today to celebrate, to dance, and to live life to the fullest, without the shadow of constant repression. Sleep well, and dream of an endless party. You, my dear listener, who perhaps regard sexual desire as a natural force, a healthy part of the human experience, something to be explored and understood, prepare yourself for a journey into a past where this same force was seen as an enemy. In the Middle Ages, sexual desire was not a blessing but a curse, a dangerous temptation that needed to be controlled, repressed, and, if possible, eradicated. Imagine a world where the Church, with its ubiquity and power, incessantly hammered home the idea that the body was a receptacle of sin. Desire, that inner flame that drives us to connection and reproduction, was seen as the clearest manifestation of lust, one of the 7 deadly sins. It was not a question of moderation, but of suppression. The flesh was weak, and the spirit oppressed by it. Think of the sermons. Priests and monks, many of them living in forced celibacy, preached about the dangers of carnal temptation. Women were often portrayed as the great temptresses, the heirs of Eve, whose forms and charms led men to perdition. Men, in turn, were seen as beings with an uncontrollable desire, a beast that needed to be tamed by reason and faith. There was no room for the idea that desire could be a positive force, an expression of love or connection. It was always a trap, a path to hell. The repression of sexual desire manifested itself in countless ways. There were fasts, penances, self-flagellations, practices designed to mortify the flesh and purify the soul. Monks and nuns lived in cloister, isolated from the world, to avoid temptations. Couples were instructed to practice abstinence at long periods of the year, such as Lent and Advent, and on holy days. Even within marriage, sex was tolerated only for procreation, and pleasure was viewed with suspicion. Guilt was a constant companion. Every impure thought, every lustful look, every touch that was not strictly for reproduction was a sin. People lived in constant fear of eternal damnation, and confession was a ritual of purification, where sins of the flesh were enumerated in detail and penitentiated. Sexuality was a burden, a source of anxiety and shame, and what happened when desire, that natural force, could not be completely repressed? He found his own paths, often in the shadows. Prostitution, as we have already seen, was a necessary evil, a way of channeling male desire away from respectable women. Masturbation, though condemned, was an inevitable reality and engendered immense guilt and fear of disease and madness. Homosexual relations, though severely punished, persisted in secret. Desire, like water, always finds a crack. Medieval society, in its attempt to control sexual desire, created an environment of hypocrisy and repression. There was no freedom to express sexuality in a healthy way, to explore one's own body, or that of one's partner, without the shadow of guilt. Intimacy was a minefield of prohibitions where pleasure was a dangerous byproduct and desire, a temptation to be fought. Think of the energy that was expended in this constant struggle against nature itself. Life was a daily battle against the impulses of the body, an attempt to elevate the spirit above the flesh. There was not the lightness, the joy, the celebration of sexuality that in more recent times we have begun to rediscover. There was only the struggle, the repression, and the constant surveillance. So the next time you're tempted to judge the desire of others or to suppress your own, remember the Middle Ages. Remember the guilt, the fear, the repression, Remember that desire is a powerful force, and that trying to eradicate it is a losing battle. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the freedom we have today to understand, accept, and yes, celebrate human sexuality in all its complexity, without the shadow of eternal damnation hanging over every kiss. Sleep well, and dream of a world where desire is a force for good. You, my dear listener, who perhaps associate intimacy with pleasant aromas, perfumed lotions, and fresh mint breath, prepare for an olfactory journey that will make your modern nose recoil in horror. In the Middle Ages, intimacy was not just a matter of touch and sight. It was above all a sensory experience dominated by smell. And frankly, it was not the most pleasant sense of smell. Imagine yourself in a medieval room, if we can call it that, a space that was more of a dark and poorly ventilated alcove. The air was already heavy with the smell of fireplace smoke, damp straw on the floor, rancid food, and of course the lingering smell of human bodies that knew no luxury of the daily bath. Add to that the scent of animals that often shared the same space, pigs, chickens, maybe a dog, each contributing their own olfactory note to the stink symphony. Now think about bodies. No soaps, no deodorants, no toothpaste. The accumulated sweat of days of hard work in the field or in the workshop impregnated the skin and clothes. Clothes, in turn, were rarely washed, absorbing all odors from the environment and the body. The smell of tallow, dirt, urine, and feces, because the latrines were rudimentary and often close to living spaces, was a constant. The breath, without oral hygiene, was a mixture of decayed teeth, inflamed gums, and the residues of the last meal, perhaps a stew of rancid vegetables or crusty bread. Intimacy in this scenario was a visceral experience. The kiss, if it happened, would come with the taste and smell of a mouth that hadn't seen a toothbrush in a lifetime. The touch would be on a skin that carried the odor of days of perspiration, perhaps with the smell of smoke and soot from a poorly ventilated fireplace. The hair, rarely washed, could have a rancid smell, mixed with odors of grease and dust. There was no expectation of a clean and fragrant body. There was only the reality of a human body in its most natural and, for our sensibility, most raw state. Think about bodily fluids, sweat, saliva, and other fluids that accompany intimacy. They all mixed with the odors already present, creating an olfactory complexity that would make any of us run to the nearest shower. There were no clean, fragrant sheets to wrap around, just heavy, dirty blankets that absorbed and retained all the smells of the night. The lack of ventilation indoors only intensified these aromas. The stagnant, heavy, and humid air caused the odors to settle on the walls, on the furniture, on the people themselves. It was a smell that could not be washed away, that could not be ignored. It was the essence of medieval life, in all its rawness and lack of hygiene. Sexuality, in this context, was an act that took place in the midst of the symphony of odors. There was not the delicacy, the sensuality that we associate with sex today. It was something more raw, more visceral, more necessary. Pleasure, if it existed, was accompanied by an olfactory awareness that, for us, would be almost unbearable. It was a constant reminder of the physical reality of existence, devoid of any idealization. So the next time you're tempted to complain about your deodorant that doesn't last all day, or your toothpaste that isn't whitening, remember the smells of medieval intimacy. Remember the absence of hygiene, the constant presence of unpleasant odors, the rawness of life. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get to appreciate the wonder of a warm bath, a scented soap, and fresh breath. Sleep well, and dream of a world of pleasant aromas. You, my dear listener, who live in an era where sex education is a debated but present topic, where information about the body, reproduction, and consent are just a click away, prepare for a trip to a past where knowledge about sexuality was a vacuum filled by superstitions, taboos, and frightening ignorance. In the Middle Ages, sex education, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Imagine the life of a young medieval man. He or she grew up in a world where the body was seen as a source of sin, sex as an act for procreation, and pleasure as a temptation to be avoided. Conversations about sexuality were non-existent or veiled by euphemisms and moralisms. Children learned about sex through observation, gossip, legends, and often traumatic experiences. There were no parents sitting down with their children to explain body changes, the importance of consent, or the risks of disease. The church, which was the primary source of education and morality, focused on the condemnation of sin. The sermons warned about lust, fornication, and adultery, but they offered no practical information about the workings of the body or sexual health. What was learned was what not to do, not what to do. Ignorance was seen as a form of innocence, and knowledge as a path to temptation. Think about the consequences of this lack of knowledge. Young women entered the wedding without the slightest idea of what to expect from their wedding night. The consummation of marriage, which was a legal and religious requirement, could be a painful and frightening experience. There was no preparation. There was no conversation. There was not the slightest understanding of one's own body or the partner's body. Pain was expected. Shame, a constant. For men, the situation was not much different. They learned about sex through experience, often with prostitutes or in clandestine encounters. The idea that sex could be an experience of mutual pleasure, communication, and respect was completely alien. What was learned was domination, the satisfaction of one's own desire, without the slightest consideration for one's partner. The lack of knowledge about reproduction was equally frightening. People did not understand how pregnancy happened, nor how to prevent it. Superstitions and magical rituals were the only form of birth control, as we have already seen. Infant and maternal mortality was sky-high, in part due to ignorance about hygiene, nutrition, and the care needed during pregnancy and childbirth. Sexually transmitted diseases spread unchecked, as there was no knowledge about their transmission or treatment. The symptoms were attributed to sins, curses, imbalances of moods, but never to a biological cause that could be prevented or treated. The stigma was immense and the suffering was prolonged. Sexuality in this context was a mystery, a taboo, a minefield of dangers and prohibitions. There was no freedom to ask questions, to seek information, to understand one's own body. There was only silence, shame, and the constant threat of sin and condemnation. Think about vulnerability. People were left to fend for themselves, without the tools to navigate one of the most fundamental aspects of the human experience. Ignorance was a prison, and lack of sex education was one of its highest walls. So the next time you're tempted to complain about the complexity of modern sex education, or the amount of information available, remember the Middle Ages. Remember the silence, the shame, the ignorance. Remember that knowledge is power and that sex education is an essential tool for health, well-being, and freedom. And maybe, just maybe, you'll begin to appreciate the importance of every conversation, every book, every class that helps us understand and celebrate human sexuality in a healthy and informed way. Sleep well, and dream of a world of knowledge and clarity. You, my dear listener, who perhaps believe that the Middle Ages are a distant and dusty chapter of history, with no relevance to your daily life, prepare yourself for a revelation that will make you realize that the shadows of that past still extend over the present. In the Middle Ages, attitudes toward sex were shaped by a mixture of religion, pragmatism, and ignorance. And as much as we've come, many of the taboos, fears, and prejudices of that time still echo in our conversations, in our laws, and in our minds. Imagine for a moment, the view of sex as something intrinsically sinful, intended only for procreation and devoid of pleasure, still resonates in certain religious doctrines and moralistic discourses. The idea that the body is a source of temptation, especially the female body, and that it needs to be covered and controlled, has not completely disappeared. Think about the discussions about dress, about modesty, about decency in public. It is not difficult to draw a direct line back to medieval veils and woolen layers. The lack of sex education, which was the norm in the Middle Ages, is still a problem in many parts of the world. Ignorance about one's own body, about consent, about the prevention of diseases and pregnancy, continues to generate suffering and vulnerability. Although we have access to an immense amount of information, the taboos and shame surrounding sex still prevent many people from seeking the knowledge necessary for a healthy and safe sex life. The consequences of this educational gap are in many ways a direct legacy of the medieval era. Think of the hypocrisy surrounding sexuality. In the Middle Ages, the Church condemned prostitution, but tolerated it and even profited from it. It condemned broken celibacy, but many clergymen had mistresses. He condemned homosexuality, but it persisted in secret. This duality between what is preached and what is practiced, between public morality and private reality, is still a characteristic of many societies. The shame and judgment that accompany deviant or unconventional sexuality are direct echoes of medieval condemnation. The view of women as property, whose sexuality is controlled and whose value lies in their reproductive capacity, although fought, still manifests itself in subtle and not-so-subtle forms of misogyny and control over the female body. The struggles for reproductive autonomy, for gender equality, and for an end to sexual violence are, in essence, a continuation of the battle against medieval power structures that saw women as an object, not as a subject. Even the idea that marriage is a pragmatic arrangement, more about security and status than romantic love, still persists in some cultures and families, albeit to a lesser extent. The pressure to have children, to perpetuate the lineage, to conform to social expectations instead of following one's heart, are remnants of a time when love was a luxury and marriage a business. The Middle Ages, with its brutality, its lack of hygiene, its repression and its taboos, may seem a distant world, but their attitudes toward sex, the body and morality have left deep marks on the collective psyche. The fear of pleasure, the guilt associated with desire, the shame of the body, all of these have deep roots in that period. It is not a matter of judging the past with the eyes of the present, but of recognizing that history is not a closed book. It continues to influence us, shape our perceptions, and challenge our notions of freedom and progress. Sexuality, in all its complexity, is a mirror that reflects not only who we are today, but also where we came from. And understanding this legacy is the first step to building a freer, more compassionate, and more conscious future. And so, my dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the intricate and sometimes uncomfortable realities of medieval sexuality. I hope that this exploration has been as calming as it has been enlightening, and that the images of rare baths and pungent odors have driven away any trace of insomnia. Think of the brutal simplicity of life at that time, where privacy was a myth and pleasure a sin. Compare it to the comfort of your own bed, the softness of your pillow, the freedom of your choices. Feel the weight of your body sink into the mattress. Breathing becomes slower and deeper. Let the worries of the day dissolve like smoke from a medieval fireplace. There are no longer hard and fast rules, nor the shadow of eternal damnation hanging over you, just the peace and silence of the night. Give thanks for the running water, the soap, the freedom to love and be loved without the need for magic potions or worrying about divine wrath for a kiss. The Middle Ages, with all its peculiarities, reminds us how far we have come, and how precious are the freedoms that we take for granted today. May this reflection lead you to a deep and restful sleep, free of taboos and unpleasant smells. May your dreams be light and your thoughts serene.